pleased to be here today so that I can share my passionate belief that arts and cultural organizations must put the audience first and focus on the needs of all guests, including those who require accessibility services. Today, I'm going to share with you how my focus on accessibility services developed, tell the story of how a group of South Florida arts organizations came together around this topic, show how my organization embraces this commitment, and share some words of wisdom from people who inspire me. My hope is that by sharing what I've learned and the experiences I've had, you too will embrace a commitment to accessibility. Imagine for a moment a time before this center. It was the early 2000s, and the Ziff Ballet Opera House looked more like this. And now consider that the project's architect just climbed 6 stories of scaffolding to check the sightlines from the last row of the highest tier. From this perspective, Cesar Pelli said, "Perfect." Why? Because at that moment he knew that the sightlines and accessibility he had designed for the last row of the 4th tier allowed that high school student who used a wheelchair and wanted to sit with his friends at the back of 4th tier to do so and be just like the rest of the kids. He knew that every level of the venue was accessible, from orchestra to the 4th tier. He had a vision of a place where real people, regardless of ability, could create lasting memories together with the arts. And I think that it is our job to embrace this vision and move it forward. But architecture alone isn't nearly enough to meet the needs of our guests. In order to meet these needs, it takes a knowledgeable and committed staff to continue their education about accessibility and be responsive to the needs of the guests. I believe that by listening a little more, caring a little more, and doing a little more, we cross the threshold from what is expected to a place where we can make real people's lives a little better by giving equal access to the entire family, regardless of ability. We know that accessibility services are not a set-it-and-forget-it process. It is ever-changing, and there is no one-size-fits-all solution. While we are committed to being proactive and responsive to the needs of the guest, there's always more that we can do and always more to plan for the future. Now I'd like to share a journey with you about how we increased our knowledge and changed some practices, because I think when you know better, you do better. My focus on accessibility changed dramatically when I attended my first LEAD conference back in 2009. LEAD is Leadership Exchange in Arts and Disability. This organization is focused on accessible needs within the arts community and is fostered by the Kennedy Center. And it was at my second LEAD conference when I was sitting around a table with colleagues from neighboring venues in South Florida that a simple yet significant idea came to fruition. We were having a casual conversation about the services we provided and the performances we had, and we realized that we had 3 significant things in common. The first is location. The people around the table represented 5 organizations within a 1 hour's drive of one another. The second is audience. While we didn't all have the exact same audience, there was enough crossover that we'd hear from guests how they'd handle the situations differently at our neighboring performing arts centers. And the third is shows. If Miami City Ballet is playing at our venue and again at Kravis Center in West Palm Beach, the ballet is going to want to provide the same services at both venues. And we started to compare notes, and it all clicked. If the same customer is attending multiple venues, they are going to expect the same great service at each place. If there's a service being provided elsewhere in South Florida, don't we want to provide the same service at our venue? So why did we have to travel to Washington, D.C. for a conference to discuss our issues with venues that are less than an hour drive when we could meet regularly without any added expense? At that moment, these 5 organizations renewed their commitment to accessibility and decided to meet on a quarterly basis with a mission to promote, provide, and facilitate equal access to every individual wanting to experience the arts. And we formed FLACA. FLACA is Florida Access Coalition for the Arts. We began having quarterly meetings, and we were able to hear the concerns and services that other venues had. We were able to coordinate efforts to meet guest expectation for services and provide the show's information in advance so we could provide similar experiences throughout South Florida for all of our guests. Since that first year, we've created an open door where any arts and accessibility organizations in South Florida can take part in the conversation. And because of this shared knowledge base and listening to one another's stories, we've seen a shift in how we approach accessibility. We did not want to have this organization create policy for each partner organization, but we wanted to stay informed of what the expectations of our guests may be because of the differing policies at these other organizations. Soon we realized we had many services in common. Assistive listening devices that amplify the sounds of the show, American Sign Language for people who are deaf or hard of hearing and have learned the language of ASL, open captioning where guests who have hearing loss but have not learned ASL can read the dialogue of what's happening on stage, touch tours that provide a sensory experience to people who are blind or have low vision to feel specific elements from the show to help them visualize what's happening on the stage, swing arm seating for easy transfer from mobility devices to theater seats, and spaces for mobility devices for guests who do not transfer to theater seats. Immediately, we found benefits to the open communication that FLACA facilitated. For years, the Arsht Center had provided open captioning for Broadway shows, but we struggled when it was requested for some other shows because some artists thought that it might be distracting to other guests, even though it was our experience that open captioning was helpful to all guests, even those who had no hearing loss. We were determined to put our guests first and began putting a clause in all of our contracts for the provision of accessible services as deemed necessary by the venue. By sharing this information with other FLACA members, this provision is now in all of our contracts, and we have had an easier time expanding our open caption services when the need arises. With FLACA, we now have a shared resource of additional ASL interpreters, so that when a guest wants to have a rock concert interpreted, we have more resources. Rather than just the 2 regular interpreters, we have a list that incorporates all interpreters used by our partner organizations, and now we can better meet the needs of our guests. Will you go beyond the bare bones requirements of effective communication and embrace a philosophy of excellent customer service for all? Will you do your job just a little bit better in order to dramatically improve someone's life? Prior to our FLACA meetings, some of our partner organizations had no idea that you could borrow Braille opera librettos from the Library of Congress. Florida Grand Opera had been doing this for years, but by them sharing this knowledge, other regional opera companies now know of this service. We invested in bariatric chairs, which are about 15 inches wider than a typical theater seat, for guests who require additional space in a theater seat. And because of FLACA, we found out that Broward Center had audio described performances. Audio description uses a separate channel on assistive listening devices and provides a description of the setting and action that's happening on the stage throughout the performance so that guests who are blind or have low vision can visualize what's happening on the stage. Broward Center generously offered to have their audio describers help train describers at our venue. We built a pool of volunteers who are passionate about expanding the theater experience to guests who are blind or had low vision. And this year, we won an award from the American Council of the Blind for outstanding contributions to the establishment and continued development of significant audio description programs. One customer wrote to us after attending an opera performance that had both audio description and a touch tour. Since my wife's illness, I want to make as many wonderful memories with her as I can. I never thought the opera would be so real for me. You have given me a blessing words can't begin to describe. A few years ago, the Americans with Disabilities Act added some regulations, making it mandatory to expand access to wheelchair seats across all sales channels. We quickly made sure that guests could access wheelchair spaces, swing arm seats, and companion seats from the web. But then we asked, why stop there? So we have messaging on our ASL open captioning as well as our swing arms, wheelchair, and companion seats, so that every guest can have an equal and accommodating purchase on the web. And to make sure that guests using screen readers and other accessibility devices can use our site effectively, we've elected to conduct annual accessibility compliance audits to ensure that pages and images are properly labeled for screen readers and other accessibility devices. Another new regulation that was put into effect, but is far less discussed, is equal access to the stage. World-renowned violinist Itzhak Perlman once said, "The major issue is accessibility with dignity. I like to get into the building at the front with everybody else, where the rest of society gets in." Several times a year, we have performances where audience members are invited to come on stage for one reason or another, and we believe that it is our job to make that as equal of an experience as possible. And don't you think that if Itzhak Perlman wants to get into the building the same way, that he would also want to participate the same way as everybody else? Earlier this year, we had the show Once, which has a bar on stage where audience members can buy a drink and mingle with the cast before the show and at intermission. This element is essential to the feel of the production, but the original suggestion for guests who use mobility devices was to have them travel out the side doors and around the back to enter the bar from the side stage. But we knew that this wasn't good enough for our expected level of customer service. So we added a lift to the stage in order to provide the most similar experience possible for all of our guests. And it was noticed by the Miami Herald, where they wrote, "At the Arsht, theater goers who use wheelchairs can join in the fun, thanks to a special lift, a first for any of the Once tour stops." I'm proud of this moment and proud to be the first venue to do this, but I don't want to be the last. As professionals in the arts, I believe that at our roots, we are truly creative people. And because of this gift of creativity, we should be able to see the possibilities in any challenge. I encourage all of you to push the status quo and find ways to provide more equal access to more guests more often. Steve Krug wrote in his book, "Don't Make Me Think," a common sense approach to web usability. And it's not just the right thing to do, it's profoundly the right thing to do. Because the one argument for accessibility that doesn't get made nearly often enough is how extraordinarily better it makes some people's lives. How many opportunities do we have to dramatically improve people's lives just by doing our job a little better? But perhaps this is reminding you too much of a philosophy course you took once in college. So how about another thought? From the US Census Bureau. The US Census Bureau projects that the number of people 65 and older will more than double between 2000 and 2030, from 35 million to 71.5 million people. And the number of older adults will not only increase at the 65-year-old end of the spectrum, there will be twice as many people 85 and older in 2030, with 9.6 million individuals projected to be part of the population. One of the things we discuss over and over in arts institutions is how are we going to attract a younger audience? But from this framework, I ask you, how will you keep your older audience, your most faithful and philanthropic of audiences, for as long as possible? How will you change your commitment to accessibility so that this guy can do this? How can you create a culture where everyone is welcome to your venue and everyone contributes to the fabric that is your organization? Thank you.